When thinking of an illustration of the role the Bible plays in the Christian life, the story I've heard told the most goes something like this. Imagine buying something fairly complex, say a new smartphone. If you're anything like me, you just can't wait to get it to do all the things you've seen in the advertising. But by the end of the evening, after playing with it, I can barely make a phone call with it, let alone run all the apps my daughter can run on her phone, and I wonder if I will properly get it functioning. The next day I take it back to the shop where I got it from, and the salesman explains to me how it works, and casually mentions there was a leaflet included and some access to an online manual. My wife looks at me exasperated and says, "You mean to tell me we've took it back to the shop complaining that it doesn't work and you've never looked at the instructions? No wonder you couldn't figure it out." The point, of course, is obvious. To make sense of anything, to sort it out, to know how things should really work. Does it not make sense to refer to the maker's instructions rather than just grope around in the dark? And the spiritual moral of the story is that our Maker has provided us with a handbook for life, instructions to help us make sense of things, how best to live our lives and sort things out. The problem, of course, is if those who have heard the illustration then pick up a Bible, they will be struck by the fact that the Bible hardly reads like any standard handbook or set of maker's instructions. The first thing they will come across, of course, is a creation story, and then a long narrative about the origins of an ancient tribe of people. When did you last read anything like that in a book of instructions? In fact, when looking through the Bible, you will find a whole diversity of fascinating literature, but none of it, to be honest, resembles a set of maker's instructions that I've ever seen before. To put it another way, if you worked for the company that made the smartphone and had been asked to put together the manual, how would your manager have reacted if you suggested incorporating into it the kind of material and literature we find in the Bible? See, I imagine the initial briefing, before compiling the handbook, they would have said, well, the client needs to have clear, unambiguous statements, how best to operate the smartphone. If you suggested that perhaps it would be more interesting to start with a long genealogy of all the previous smartphones, or that you could include a parable, the parable of the lost phone, or a psalm of praise to the maker of all phones, your manager would likely look somewhat bemused. And if you got carried away and suggested that it should start with a creation narrative and end with a grand apocalypse, he'd likely to exclaim, "What are you writing here? The Bible or an instruction manual? Make your mind up, will you?" To format an instruction manual like the Bible is not likely to make that much sense to the company. In fact, this common illustration might be forcing the Bible into a rather modernist mould, a rather unnatural and alien mould. For can you imagine this Sunday school illustration being used in the past? Surely Maker's Instructions is a rather modern genre. It certainly isn't an ancient one. I can't imagine you being given a handbook when you bought a new chariot or part exchanged a camel. In fact, the illustration could only have made much sense to people since the Industrial Revolution. So for most of church history, it's not an obvious illustration to explain to people how to approach the Bible. Now, of course, the biggest contrast between what you find in the Bible and what you find in a set of instructions is not just the whole diversity of styles of writing, but the fact that the literature is placed within a story, and in many ways tells a story. I've never come across a set of instructions written as a narrative, with a past, present or future, and an exciting plot. It's never struck me as a page-turner. I've never wondered with a set of instructions, what's going to happen in the next chapter? How's the plot going to develop? But of course the big issue we face is that if we recognise that Scripture is a story, how is it authoritative? It's easy to see a set of instructions being able to guide us in our lives. It's not so easy to see how that works with a story. I remember being asked, in public, in a secular college where I was working, in a fairly aggressive way, whether I read the Bible literally. I can't remember what I said at the time. I don't think it was that helpful. But afterwards, I wish I'd remembered that familiar metaphor of taking the Bible as a library. In fact, because we're in a college, I wish I'd walked with the person down the corridor to the college library, opened the door, and looked at the books and asked the same question of him. Do you take these books in this library literally? In fact, I think he might have had problems comprehending my question. For to ask such a simple question about such a varied collection of books makes little sense, does it? In fact, he might make the point by going round the different collections of books in the library. He might say, look, we've got science here and we've got history there, and it does make some sense to ask whether you take that literally. But of course, some of the literature in this library, I couldn't understand how you could take it literally. He might go to the poetry or the romantic poets and pick out some famous Wordsworth, I wandered lonely as a cloud. I mean, he'd say, how could I take that literally? Wordsworth is not implying that we're somehow water vapour or something like that. So it depends on the style of literature in this library, whether I am meant to take it literally at all. And of course I'd want to make the same point. Your question about the Bible, taking that literally, makes as much sense as talking about this whole library. And I'd want to point out that there are different styles of literature within Scripture, a bit like there is in a library. And you can't just ask that simple question, do you take it literally, without discussing what genre of literature it is. As helpful as this metaphor is in approaching the Bible, it does fall down at a crucial point when thinking about biblical interpretation. Because most libraries I'm familiar with have categorised the books for you. There are useful labels attached to them. Sometimes there's stickers on the shelves telling you what the sections contain. Sometimes when you pick up a volume, there's a helpful introduction telling you what to expect within the pages of this book. But do the books of the Bible come with labels attached, telling you the kind of literature it is, or with a helpful introduction to the genre you're about to encounter? Often we have to do that work ourselves. There's no biblical librarian who's done the categorising for us or given us a helpful introduction. So, for instance, if you pick up the Psalms, there are no introductory comments telling you that much of what you're reading here is pretty poetic. It's not that we're left clueless, but of course the clues come from a different culture and a different time. I once read an illustration of this in terms of a joke. If you went to a fairly un-PC comedy club in England, the comedian might start a joke by saying there was an Englishman, an Irishman and a Scotsman, and then tell an amusing story of what happened to them. But if you visited the comedy club from another culture, you wouldn't probably pick up from that introduction the clue not to take the story literally. You could end up walking out of the club believing that these things really happened to the Englishman, the Irishman and the Scotsman. So not only have the biblical books not been categorised for us clearly in how to interpret them, but what clues there are come from a different culture and a different time. So the library illustration can only really take us so far. We're not only faced with this question of interpretation when we first pick up a book, but also, of course, as we read through it. If you pick up one of the synoptic Gospels, it's not long before you hear Jesus saying something like, "There was a man who went out to sow, or was looking after sheep, or was travelling somewhere." Jesus doesn't say, "Let me tell you an imaginary story." He just says, "There was a man." We've had to pick up the clues through reading these and realise that they are just stories. And sometimes it's a dramatic style of speech we have to interpret. Before Jesus proclaims, "If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, and if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away," Jesus doesn't say, "Well, don't whatever you do, try this at home." He doesn't give us a warning. He doesn't say to us, "Look, I'm going to use a piece of hyperbole here, guys. Don't take it literally." But I don't know any sane person who's ever taken this literally. I've never met anybody in my local church who's clearly had an injury that week, and when I've inquired what's happened to them, they pointed me to that passage in Matthew to explain it. We've picked it up that it's hyperbole and interpreted it that way. The metaphor of a library gets over the fact that within the pages of Scripture there's real diversity of literature, but it doesn't highlight the fact that we're often left to discern this ourselves and to interpret the different forms of discourse. The illustration of the Bible as a library highlights the fact that in approaching the different books of the Bible, we need to take seriously what kind of literature it is and interpret it accordingly. But if this is true of the individual books, can we say something about the Bible as a whole? Is there a dominant style of literature, dominant genre, that might help us in our overall interpretation of Scripture? Now, the most common suggestion is that of narrative. It's not that so much of Scripture is just written in narrative. That's true. We've got the Old Testament history books. We've got the Gospels themselves. But of course there's a sense in which the whole of Scripture is framed within a narrative, from creation to new creation, or from the garden in Genesis to the city in Revelation. But even when it's not exactly narrative itself, often it's a reflection, or we find a reflection on those stories. So in the Psalms we hear some reflection of the story of Israel, and we find that also in the New Testament epistles. But once we start saying it's story or it's narrative overall, and that's the framework perhaps, we won't only find continuity, we'll also find discontinuity. We'll find a sense of development if it's a story. Recognising this discontinuity as well as continuity within the Christian scriptures, this ongoing development, is one of the ways in which seeing the Bible as an instruction manual, as a handbook, just doesn't work, because there's little or any development or plot within that kind of literature. To help illustrate this point, some writers have suggested that we look at Scripture in terms of a drama, a play, and of course dramas and plays normally have acts or scenes. Exactly how many scenes or acts you might divide Scripture into, and what exactly you might call them, of course, is open to interpretation. But let's, for the sake of this illustration, go with 5. The writer Tom Wright suggests that there might be 5 acts: creation, fall, Israel, Jesus, the church. One of the consequences of this is we might have to think twice when taking something from one act, perhaps an earlier act, and applying it to something later. We might have to think, how has the story moved on? Is it still applicable? Is it still relevant once a story has developed?
I'm now not quite clear when I first thought of the idea of a 5-act unfinished play. It goes back at least to the mid-80s, I think, in the work I was doing. And to be honest, one of the main drivers for it for me was being frustrated with people who would say, for instance, Leviticus tells us not to wear two types of cloth in our garments. Since we know that that's now irrelevant, like the sacrificial system, therefore basically all that stuff in the Old Testament, that's just irrelevant. It's not part of our scene anymore. And then people saying, and therefore we can do the same with the New Testament. The New Testament set aside bits of the Old Testament. We're in a different culture, so we set aside bits of the New. And there was one of those moments for me where you hear something and you think, well, I know that's not right, but I'm not quite sure how to get at it. And it was at that time that I was working anyway with the Gospels and what sort of documents they are. And so I rather tentatively started thinking about this idea of drama and the way that drama works, and the way that within the same drama, different things happen, so that at one point Jack is going up the beanstalk and another point he's coming down the beanstalk, but that doesn't mean that the story is self-contradictory, because that's how stories work. You do this and then you do that later. And it's only if you try and abstract the Bible and turn it into a kind of a list of rules or true doctrines to pin on the wall where you would think any differently. And of course, the Bible contains lots and lots of true doctrines and true ethics. I mean, people sometimes think that I'm denying that, but of course I'm not. But it does so within a story. And if, put it like this, if God intended us to have the Bible more or less as we've got it, Genesis to Revelation, which I think God did, then it is an entire story, from the garden to the city, from creation to new creation, etc. And all the multifarious bits within it find their place within that story, which quite obviously has very different movements. The other thing that was driving me at that point was trying to understand Paul and the law, which I did a lot of work on in the early 80s, in dialogue with Sanders and Rezanen and people like that, where Paul in Galatians is basically saying, God gave the law, but he gave it for a particular time. And that means that Paul is looking back at the history of Israel and saying there was a period then where the law was given and it really meant what it said, and it wasn't demonic, it wasn't bad, it wasn't a first way of saving people which God then had to abandon. And so Paul is telling a story in which Abraham and the promises to Abraham are still going on, with the law as a kind of bracketed section in between. You see it in Romans 5 as well, it does exactly the same thing. And trying to come to terms with that forced me into narrative mode, and I was in dialogue particularly with Richard Hayes at that time, who did a lot of work on the narrative substructure of Paul, so I was having my mind open to that. So out of all that there came this 5-act model, which I continue to think has been fruitful.
But if we talk in terms of the Bible primarily being a narrative or a drama or a story or a play, can we still talk in traditional terms about it? Can we still talk about the authority of Scripture, or Scripture being authoritative for the church? Now, of course, if we had our model of handbook or instruction manual, it's fairly obvious how that could be authoritative, but it's not so clear when we come at it in terms of narrative. One suggestion of how this might work, though, could be captured if we use a bit of imagination. Imagine for one moment that tomorrow's media is full of an exciting discovery. When trawling through some archives, some staff in a museum discovered a play, and they all became convinced that this is a Shakespearean play. But what's unique is this is a Shakespearean play no one had ever seen before or heard of before. Of course there was a real demand to see this play performed. But there was a major disappointment, a major problem, because as people read through the play, it dawned on them that actually it was an unfinished drama. It petered out in the middle of Act 5. There was no resolution to this drama. If the play was ever to be performed, there was going to have to be something done about this ending, or lack of ending rather. Some people suggested that perhaps a modern playwright might finish it off, but not everybody was convinced. In fact, they decided to go for a radical suggestion. It was suggested, why not give the play to a company that was experienced in producing and performing Shakespearean dramas, and let the actors come to the part of the drama where it was unfinished and be left to improvise the conclusion and the finale. Now, if you were the producer of this production and it came to the part where the actors had to improvise the final scene, I think there might be a few reasons that would tempt you to interrupt and stop the drama. There are certain things that might happen where you might not be convinced that you're seeing true improvisation. For instance, if it got to that part and the act had to improvise and all they did was to repeat a speech they'd said earlier, say in Act 3, just say the speech again in Act 5, even though things had moved on, you might interrupt them as the producer and say, that's not improvisation. That's just woodenly saying what you said before, even though things have moved on, it's not applicable anymore. But there might be another reason that you'd interrupt the improvisation and not be convinced about how genuine it was. It might be the case that someone would lose the plot entirely and go out of character. And you might stop them and say, to be honest, I don't think your character would ever say that. What's what you're saying now got to do with what's gone before and the rest of the drama up to that point? What you're saying's just off the wall. It doesn't bear any relationship to the character or the plot or the narrative that's led up to that point. That's not improvisation, that's something totally different. See, there's a sense in which you've got to be true to what's gone before, even in improvisation. Now, of course, the point that's made here by people who have developed this idea of an authoritative narrative is to say those people performing the drama are the church. And that's how Scripture functions for the church. It gives a framework of narrative or story, of character, up to a particular point, and then the church as the people of God and the people of that narrative need to be true to it. And of course there are times where people just repeat what's gone before and don't realise how things moved on, and we might want to call that fundamentalism. And there are times where the people of God lose the plot entirely and go totally out of character, and what they're saying and doing bears little of any relationship to what's gone before and the drama of Scripture, and we might want to call that heresy. But there is something in between those two which might be known as faithful improvisation, when you're in character but when you're aware that things have moved on and you just cannot repeat woodenly what's gone before.
So yes, people have tried, and I don't mind. I suppose I was one of the first to think of it like this, but lots of other people have written about improvisation. Sam Wells has, Francis Young has, The Art of Performance, various other very interesting writers, some with reference to me, some not with reference to me. It's a free world. I don't feel sort of any sense of propriety about this. I just think if this is a good heuristic tool which will help people to understand that, yes, Leviticus is our book in the same way that the family photographs from the 1830s that somebody investigated, unearthed, it wouldn't be photographs from the 1830s, you know what I mean, the family albums and letters and things, they are my family, even though they did things in a very different way from how I do it. But we can learn from that, and there's a genetic narrative which is going forward. And Abraham, the story of Abraham is our story, but learning to say that in a nuanced way, and then learning to say, the New Testament remains our charter. Every jot and tittle of the New Testament remains our charter throughout the period of the New Covenant until God makes new heavens and new earth.